Welcome to SCMP.
My pleasure to be here.
So what do you make of the latest escalation of the trade war in terms of both the US and China's responses to one another?
Yeah. The big question is whether it is just a trade war or whether it is something bigger. Now, if this was a trade war, and if the goal of the United States was to reduce the trade deficit with China, it can be done. China is ready to cooperate. China is ready to buy more American products. But if the goal is to stop China from becoming the number one economy in the world, and if the goal of some of Trump's advisors, as they've said very openly, is to decouple the United States economy from China's economy in the hope that China's economy will stop growing. Now, if that's the goal, decoupling, then it's a very different game. So what is causing a lot of confusion in the world is that people are not sure whether this is purely a trade war or a much larger geopolitical contest. And my guess is that this is a much larger geopolitical contest that is emerging between the world's number one power, United States of America, and the world's number one emerging power, which is China.
What can China actually do to further cement its global standing?
The best thing that China can do is to do the exact opposite of what the United States is doing. And the tragedy here is that even though the United States gifted the 1945 rules-based order to the world at the end of World War II, the United States, especially under Trump, is walking away from global multilateral institutions. China should do the opposite and should work towards strengthening the global multilateral institutions along the lines that were clearly expressed by President Xi in the two speeches he gave in Geneva and Davos in January 2017. And if China implements what President Xi said in those two speeches, I have no doubt that China's global standing will rise.
What would you say to those who want to believe that you have been too generous in your assessments of China?
Well, the question is, what is the fair and objective standards for understanding China? If you think it's the Anglo-Saxon media, which I think has got a jaundiced view of China, then clearly my views are different. But what I'm saying is that what makes China's behavior unusual is that if you compare China's behavior today with what United States was doing at an equivalent time in its history at the late 19th century, then it's quite amazing that when the United States was emerging as a great power, especially under Teddy Roosevelt, it was conquering countries, bullying countries, declaring wars, and China is doing the exact opposite. And China is the only great power which hasn't fought an interstate war in 40 years and hasn't fired a bullet across its border in 30 years. This is very unusual behavior for an emerging great power, and it's in our interest, the world's interest, to actually say, China, please keep on doing what you are doing and don't behave like how other great powers did when they emerged as great powers.
What are your thoughts on the anti-government protests rolling in Hong Kong? I mean, Beijing has been saying that Hong Kong is being a bargaining chip of the US. Do you buy that? And how do Singaporeans react to this?
Well, as a student of history, I believe that when you have such social unrest, they are the result of fundamental socio-economic causes. And if you look, for example, at the last 30 years, and it says if you compare just China and Hong Kong, in the last 30 years of China's history have been the best 30 years for the bottom 50% of China's population, because they have seen a spectacular improvement in their living conditions, in nutrition, healthcare, education, jobs, travel, and so on and so forth. By contrast, if you look at the bottom 50%, of Hong Kong's population, they have seen no improvement in their living conditions, indeed a deterioration of living conditions. And if you're a graduate of a Hong Kong university, no matter how brilliantly you do, you cannot afford to buy an apartment in Hong Kong. So something has gone wrong in terms of the socio-economic conditions of the bottom 50% of Hong Kong's population. And I think if you address that, then you're addressing the root causes of the unrest in Hong Kong.
Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong urged both US and China not to make small states to take sides. Now, how has Singapore been impacted by the US-China rivalry?
Well, I was present in the room when Prime Minister Lee delivered the speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue on US-China relations. And I thought it was a very brave speech on his part to speak very frankly to these two great powers of our time, United States and China, and said, you may carry on with the geopolitical contest, but please don't get us involved. Don't force us to choose sides. And I suspect that Prime Minister Lee was speaking on behalf of many countries. If I'm not mistaken, even the Australian Prime Minister praised the speech given by Prime Minister Lee. So that, I think, is very important, because what is clear is that the geopolitical contest between the United States and China will grow significantly in the next few decades, as I document in my forthcoming book, Has China Won? So we should all get ready for it, and one way of getting ready for it is to send a very clear and loud message to both Beijing and Washington DC. If you want to carry on the contest, carry on, don't get us involved.
Okay, thank you for today.
Thank you.